April 28, 1945. As Benito Mussolini's lifeless body hangs from a gas station in Milan, 5 children scattered across Europe face a terrifying reality. Their father's name, once a symbol of power and prestige, has overnight become a death sentence. Within hours, wanted posters bearing their faces would appear across Italy. Some would spend years hiding in convents in foreign countries, constantly looking over their shoulders. Others would face imprisonment, exile, and violent retribution from those seeking revenge against Il Duce's bloodline. But the most shocking fate would befall the youngest members of the family. Children who had barely understood their father's crimes yet would pay the ultimate price for his actions. This is the story of how the collapse of fascism didn't end with one man's death, but extended its brutal reach to an entire generation. The children of dictators rarely escape their father's shadow, but what happened to Mussolini's offspring goes far beyond political persecution. It's a tale of survival, tragedy, and the devastating consequences of inherited guilt in a world hungry for vengeance. Benito Mussolini's approach to family life was as calculated and authoritarian as his political career. Between 1910 and 1929, he fathered 6 children who would each play distinct roles in the fascist propaganda machine, and later face vastly different fates when their father's regime collapsed. His eldest daughter, Edda Mussolini, born in 1910, was positioned as the crown jewel of the fascist royal family. Intelligent, charismatic, and fiercely loyal to her father during his rise to power, she married Count Galeazzo Ciano in 1930, creating a political dynasty that would dominate Italian fascism for over a decade. Their wedding was treated as a national celebration, with thousands of Italians lining the streets to witness what was presented as the union of fascist aristocracy. Vittorio Mussolini, born in 1916, became his father's designated heir in the realm of propaganda and culture. He was groomed from childhood to represent the new generation of fascist leadership, appearing in carefully staged photographs and newsreels that showcase the Mussolini family's supposed perfection. Vittorio served as a bomber pilot during the Ethiopian War, writing articles that glorified Italian military superiority and the civilizing mission of fascist colonialism. Bruno Mussolini, the second son, born in 1918, was molded into the ideal fascist warrior. He excelled as a military pilot and served with distinction in both Ethiopia and Spain, where he gained fame for his aerial combat skills. Bruno embodied his father's vision of the new Italian man, physically strong, technologically advanced, and utterly dedicated to the fascist cause. His daring exploits were featured prominently in Italian media, making him a popular figure among young fascists. Romano Mussolini, born in 1927, represented a different path within the family. While his older siblings were thrust into public roles from an early age, Romano showed more interest in music than politics. This artistic inclination would later prove crucial to his survival, as it distanced him from his father's political activities and allowed him to reinvent himself in the post-war period. Anna Maria Mussolini, born in 1929, was the youngest daughter and perhaps the most tragic figure in the family story. Too young to understand the political implications of her father's actions, she would nevertheless face severe consequences for bearing the Mussolini name during the chaotic final years of the war. The 6th child, born earlier in 1915 but dying in infancy, represented the fragility that lurked beneath the facade of fascist strength and vitality. This loss deeply affected Mussolini and reinforced his obsession with projecting an image of family perfection to the Italian people. During the height of fascist power, the Mussolini children lived lives of extraordinary privilege and carefully managed publicity. They attended the finest schools, wore the most fashionable clothes, and enjoyed access to cultural and social opportunities that were denied to ordinary Italian families. Their every achievement was magnified in the press, while their failures and shortcomings were carefully concealed from public view. The children were also expected to serve as living advertisements for fascist ideology and policies. They appeared at rallies, participated in youth organizations, and gave interviews praising their father's leadership. Their personal relationships were scrutinized and often arranged to serve political purposes, with marriages and friendships evaluated for their propaganda value. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect fascist family, tensions and contradictions were already emerging that would later contribute to their downfall. Edda's strong personality often clashed with her father's authoritarian nature, while Bruno struggled with the pressure of living up to his role as the perfect fascist son. As Italy entered World War II, the Mussolini children found themselves in increasingly prominent and dangerous positions. Their association with the regime that had brought war and suffering to millions of people would soon transform from an advantage into a deadly liability. The stage was set for a dramatic reversal of fortune that would test each child's ability to survive in a world where their family name had become synonymous with tyranny and destruction. The comfortable certainties of their privileged upbringing were about to give way to a harsh reality where blood relationships offered no protection from the consequences of their father's crimes. Edda Mussolini Ciano occupied a unique position within the fascist hierarchy as both Il Duce's favorite child and the wife of his foreign minister. Her intelligence, political acumen, and fierce independence made her one of the most influential women in fascist Italy. But these same qualities would ultimately place her in mortal danger when the regime began to collapse. The relationship between Edda and her husband Galeazzo Ciano was complicated by politics, ambition, and genuine affection. Ciano had risen rapidly through the fascist ranks, partly due to his marriage to Mussolini's daughter, but also because of his diplomatic skills and personal charm. As foreign minister, he became increasingly skeptical of Italy's alliance with Nazi Germany and began to advocate for a separate peace with the Allies. By 1943, Ciano's opposition to the war had become so pronounced that he was among the fascist leaders who voted to remove Mussolini from power during the fateful Grand Council meeting of July 24th to 25th. This act of political rebellion would have devastating consequences for both Ciano and his family, as it was viewed by Mussolini as the ultimate personal betrayal. When Mussolini was restored to power by the Germans in September 1943, one of his first actions was to order the arrest and trial of the Grand Council members who had voted against him. Ciano, despite being his son-in-law, was among those condemned to death for treason. The decision to execute his daughter's husband would create a permanent rift between Mussolini and Edda that destroyed any remaining family bonds. Edda's response to her husband's death sentence was both desperate and courageous. She attempted to negotiate with her father, offering to exchange Ciano's secret diaries, which contained damaging information about fascist leaders, for her husband's life. These diaries documented the inner workings of the fascist regime, including details about war crimes, corruption, and the personalities of major figures, including Mussolini himself. The negotiations between father and daughter became increasingly bitter and personal. Edda accused her father of caring more about political vengeance than family loyalty, while Mussolini insisted that the demands of the state superseded personal relationships. The conversations, conducted in the shadow of Ciano's impending execution, revealed the complete breakdown of trust and affection between them. When it became clear that her father would not spare her husband, Edda made preparations to flee Italy with her children. She had already begun secretly negotiating with German and Swiss officials, using Ciano's diaries as leverage to secure safe passage for herself and her family. The diaries represented valuable intelligence that both the Germans and the Allies were eager to obtain. Ciano's execution on January 11, 1944, marked the point of no return in Edda's relationship with her father and the fascist regime. She had witnessed firsthand the regime's willingness to destroy its own supporters in pursuit of political objectives, and she understood that her own survival depended on escaping Italy before the final collapse. Using forged documents and assistance from German contacts, Edda successfully fled to Switzerland with her 3 children in early 1944. The escape was harrowing, involving dangerous mountain crossings and constant fear of discovery by fascist authorities who had orders to prevent her departure. The woman who had once been the princess of fascist Italy was now a refugee seeking asylum in a neutral country. In Switzerland, Edda found herself in a precarious position. While she was safe from immediate physical danger, she faced an uncertain future as the widow of a condemned fascist leader and the daughter of a dictator whose regime was collapsing. Swiss authorities interned her as a political refugee, limiting her freedom of movement while protecting her from potential assassins. The final months of the war were a time of intense anxiety for Edda, as she watched her father's regime disintegrate from afar. She had no communication with him or other family members, and she faced the terrifying prospect that the Allies might demand her extradition to face war crimes charges. Her association with the fascist regime made her a potential target for prosecution, despite her eventual opposition to her father's policies. The news of Mussolini's execution in April 1945 reached Edda in Switzerland, where she was living under Swiss protection. While she grieved for her father despite their bitter estrangement, she also understood that his death might actually improve her prospects for survival. The man whose name had made her a target was gone, potentially allowing her to rebuild her life under a new identity. But Edda's survival was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey toward rehabilitation and acceptance in post-war society. The woman who had once been among the most powerful figures in fascist Italy would now have to reinvent herself as a private citizen in a world that viewed her family name with suspicion and hatred. Her story would take even more dramatic turns as she attempted to navigate the complex politics of post-war Europe while protecting her children from the consequences of their father's political choices and their grandfather's crimes. Bruno Mussolini's story represents perhaps the most poignant tragedy among Il Duce's children. A young man who embodied his father's vision of fascist youth, yet became a victim of the very system that had created him. His death in 1941, long before the regime's collapse, spared him the fate that awaited his siblings, but also highlighted the destructive nature of fascist ideology, even toward those it claimed to celebrate. Born in 1918, Bruno grew up during the height of his father's power and was carefully molded to represent the ideal of fascist manhood. He excelled in athletics, particularly aviation, and showed a natural aptitude for the technological aspects of modern warfare that fascism claimed to embrace. His dedication to flying made him a perfect symbol of Italy's supposed technological advancement and military prowess. Bruno's military service began early, with his participation in the Ethiopian War of 1935 to 1936, serving as both genuine military duty and propaganda opportunity. He flew bombing missions against Ethiopian forces, experiences that he later wrote about in articles that celebrated the superiority of Italian aviation and the civilizing mission of fascist colonialism. His accounts of aerial combat were distributed widely in Italian media, making him a popular figure among young fascists who saw him as a role model. The Spanish Civil War provided Bruno with another opportunity to prove his worth as both a pilot and a fascist warrior. He volunteered to serve with the Italian forces supporting Francisco Franco's nationalist forces, flying dangerous missions against Republican positions. His performance in Spain enhanced his reputation and confirmed his status as one of the regime's most valuable propaganda assets. Bruno's writings from his military service revealed both his genuine skill as a pilot and his complete absorption of fascist ideology. He described aerial combat in terms that glorified violence and technological superiority, presenting Italian pilots as modern knights serving a noble cause. His articles emphasized the romantic aspects of warfare while downplaying its brutal realities, contributing to the regime's efforts to make war seem glorious and desirable. The pressure of living up to his role as the perfect fascist son took a significant toll on Bruno's psychological well-being. He was expected to excel in every aspect of his life while serving as a constant example to other young Italians. The weight of these expectations, combined with the traumatic experiences of combat, began to affect his behavior and mental health. By 1940, those close to Bruno noticed changes in his personality and behavior that suggested he was struggling with the demands placed upon him. The confident young pilot who had once thrived under public scrutiny became increasingly withdrawn and erratic. His superiors noted problems with discipline and judgment that were carefully concealed from the public to maintain his propaganda value. The circumstances surrounding Bruno's death on August 7, 1941, remain controversial and have been the subject of speculation for decades. The official report stated that he died in a flying accident while testing a new aircraft near Pisa. The plane crashed during what was described as a routine test flight, killing Bruno instantly and eliminating one of fascism's most prominent young figures. However, witnesses to the crash and subsequent investigations raised questions about whether the accident was truly accidental. Some observers noted that Bruno had been exhibiting signs of severe psychological distress in the weeks before his death, while others pointed to irregularities in the crash investigation that suggested possible cover-up efforts by authorities. The timing of Bruno's death was particularly significant, occurring during a period when the war was beginning to turn against Italy and the regime was facing increasing criticism. His loss deprived fascism of one of its most effective propaganda symbols at a crucial moment when public morale needed bolstering. Mussolini's reaction to his son's death was profound and revealing. Despite his reputation for emotional coldness, he was devastated by Bruno's loss and never fully recovered from the grief. The death of his favorite son marked the beginning of a psychological decline that would affect his decision-making during the crucial final years of the war. The regime's handling of Bruno's death demonstrated both its propaganda priorities and its fundamental dishonesty. While publicly mourning the loss of a fascist hero, officials worked to suppress any information that might damage Bruno's posthumous reputation or raise questions about the circumstances of his death. His memory was carefully managed to serve political purposes even after his tragic end. Bruno's death spared him from witnessing the collapse of everything he had believed in and fought for. Unlike his surviving siblings, he never had to confront the reality of his father's defeat or face the consequences of his association with the fascist regime. In death, he remained frozen as the perfect fascist son, a propaganda image that could never be tarnished by the harsh realities that would soon destroy his family. But the tragedy of Bruno's story extends beyond his individual fate to represent the broader destruction that fascism inflicted on an entire generation of Italian youth who were raised to worship violence and sacrifice their lives for a fundamentally corrupt ideology. Vittorio Mussolini's survival strategy during and after the collapse of fascism demonstrates both the privileges available to dictators' children and the extraordinary lengths necessary to escape the consequences of inherited guilt. As his father's designated cultural heir and a prominent figure in fascist propaganda, Vittorio faced particular dangers when the regime collapsed. Throughout the 1930s and early 1940s, Vittorio had served as one of fascism's most effective cultural ambassadors. He worked in the Italian film industry, producing and directing movies that promoted fascist ideology, while presenting himself as a sophisticated intellectual who represented the modern face of Mussolini's regime. His involvement in cinema gave him international contacts and cultural credibility that would prove crucial to his later survival. Vittorio's position as a filmmaker also allowed him to travel extensively, both within Italy and abroad, building relationships with individuals who were not necessarily committed fascists, but who respected his professional abilities. These connections, developed during the height of his father's power, would become lifelines when the political situation reversed and the Mussolini name became a liability. When Italy's military situation began to deteriorate in 1942 and 1943, Vittorio was among the first family members to recognize that the regime's days were numbered. His work in the film industry had given him access to information about international opinion and the true state of Italy's war effort, allowing him to make more realistic assessments than other family members who were insulated from unpleasant realities. As the political crisis deepened following the Allied invasion of Sicily, Vittorio began making discreet preparations for a potential flight from Italy. He converted assets into portable form, established contacts in neutral countries, and developed contingency plans for rapid departure if the situation became desperate. His planning was careful and methodical, reflecting both his intelligence and his understanding of the dangers he would face. The announcement of his father's arrest in July 1943 placed Vittorio in immediate danger. As one of the most recognizable members of the Mussolini family, he faced potential imprisonment by the new Badoglio government, or vengeful attacks by anti-fascist groups. His association with fascist cultural policies made him a particular target for intellectuals and artists who had suffered under the regime's censorship and control. Vittorio's initial response was to seek protection from German forces that were moving into Italy following the collapse of the fascist government. His connections within the regime and his reputation as a loyal fascist initially provided him with some security, but he quickly realized that the Germans viewed him primarily as a potential propaganda asset, rather than someone worthy of protection for his own sake. The rescue of Mussolini by German commandos in September 1943 created new opportunities and dangers for Vittorio. While his father's restoration to power in the Republic of Salo offered potential protection, it also increased the scrutiny on all family members and made them more visible targets for partisan attacks and Allied bombing raids. Vittorio's decision to flee Italy was finally triggered by specific intelligence about partisan plans to kidnap or kill members of the Mussolini family. Unlike some of his siblings, he understood that his survival could not depend on his father's protection or German guarantees. The collapse of organized authority in much of northern Italy meant that anyone could become a target of vigilante justice. The escape itself was a carefully orchestrated operation that involved multiple stages and numerous accomplices. Vittorio used his contacts in the film industry to obtain false documents and establish a cover story that would allow him to travel without attracting attention. His knowledge of European geography and languages, gained through his cultural work, proved invaluable in navigating the dangerous journey. Switzerland became Vittorio's initial destination, but Swiss authorities were reluctant to grant asylum to prominent fascist figures who might face war crimes charges. The Swiss government was attempting to maintain neutrality while preparing for the post-war period, and harboring Mussolini's children could complicate their relationships with the Allied powers. Vittorio's eventual solution was to continue beyond Switzerland to South America, where several countries were willing to accept Italian refugees without asking too many questions about their political backgrounds. Argentina, in particular, was emerging as a destination for former fascist officials who possessed skills or connections that might be useful to Juan Perón's developing regime. The journey to Argentina was long and dangerous, involving multiple border crossings, document changes, and periods of hiding in various European locations. Vittorio traveled under assumed names and false identities, relying on a network of contacts that included former fascist officials, sympathetic clergy, and smugglers who specialized in moving political refugees. Arriving in Argentina in late 1945, Vittorio faced the challenge of rebuilding his life while concealing his true identity from those who might seek revenge against his family. The film industry skills that had made him a valuable propaganda asset for fascism now became the foundation for a new career in a country that was eager to develop its own entertainment industry. But even in South America, thousands of miles from the scenes of his father's crimes, Vittorio could never fully escape the shadow of the Mussolini name or the knowledge that his survival depended on the continued secrecy of his true identity. Romano Mussolini's story represents perhaps the most successful reinvention among Il Duce's children, demonstrating how artistic talent and political timing could sometimes overcome even the most notorious family connections. His passion for jazz music, ironically a musical form that his father's regime had attempted to suppress as degenerate American influence, became the key to his survival and eventual acceptance in post-war society. Born in 1927, Romano was significantly younger than his siblings, and therefore less involved in the political activities of the fascist regime during its height. While his older brothers and sister were thrust into public roles and propaganda functions, Romano was allowed to pursue his musical interests with relatively little interference. This distance from politics, which might have seemed like a disadvantage during the regime's peak, proved to be his salvation when everything collapsed. Romano's musical talents manifested early, and he showed particular aptitude for piano performance and jazz improvisation. His interest in American jazz music put him at odds with official fascist cultural policies, which condemned jazz as racially inferior and culturally corrupting. However, his father's indulgence and the family's privileged position allowed him to study and perform music that would have been forbidden to other Italian youth. The irony of Mussolini's youngest son embracing a musical form that the regime officially despised was not lost on those who knew the family. Romano's jazz performances became a form of quiet rebellion against his father's ideology, even though he was too young to fully understand the political implications of his musical choices. When the fascist regime collapsed in 1943, Romano's age and musical focus initially protected him from the immediate dangers that faced other family members. At 16, he was not considered a significant political threat, and his association with jazz music actually helped establish his credentials as someone who had never fully embraced fascist ideology. Romano's musical abilities provided him with valuable connections outside the political sphere. Jazz musicians, by their very nature, tended to be cosmopolitan and anti-authoritarian, making them natural opponents of fascist ideology. Romano's reputation as a talented pianist opened doors to communities that might otherwise have been hostile to anyone bearing the Mussolini name. The American jazz influence that fascism had condemned became Romano's pathway to acceptance in the post-war world. Allied soldiers and officials stationed in Italy were often jazz enthusiasts themselves, and they were impressed by Romano's musical abilities and his apparent rejection of his father's political legacy. These connections proved invaluable in establishing his legitimacy as an artist rather than a political figure. Romano's strategy for survival was essentially to disappear into the music world while his father's regime collapsed around him. He avoided political discussions, focused entirely on his artistic development, and allowed his musical reputation to overshadow his family connections. This approach required careful navigation, as he needed to distance himself from fascism without appearing to betray his family. The period immediately following Mussolini's execution was particularly dangerous for Romano, as anti-fascist groups sought revenge against anyone connected to the former regime. His youth and musical reputation provided some protection, but he was still forced to live carefully and avoid situations where his family name might make him a target for violence. Romano's breakthrough came when he began performing with American jazz musicians who were stationed in Italy as part of the Allied occupation forces. These performances demonstrated his genuine musical ability and helped establish his credibility as an artist who had transcended his political background. The American musicians served as unofficial ambassadors who vouched for his character and talent. The post-war period saw Romano gradually building a legitimate career as a jazz pianist and composer. He performed in clubs throughout Italy and eventually gained international recognition for his musical abilities. His association with jazz, once a liability under his father's regime, became a symbol of his rejection of fascist ideology and his embrace of democratic values. Romano's marriage to Anna Maria Schiccolone, the sister of actress Sophia Loren, further helped establish his credentials in the entertainment world, while providing him with connections to influential figures who were not associated with fascist politics. This alliance demonstrated that he was accepted by mainstream Italian society despite his family background. By the 1950s, Romano had successfully reinvented himself as a respected musician, whose family name was increasingly viewed as an historical curiosity rather than a source of contemporary danger. His concerts drew audiences who came to hear his music rather than gawk at Mussolini's son, indicating that he had achieved a level of artistic legitimacy that transcended his political inheritance. Romano's musical career would continue for decades, allowing him to build a new identity based on his own achievements rather than his father's legacy. His success demonstrated that even the children of dictators could sometimes escape their inherited guilt through talent, timing, and the careful cultivation of non-political identities. But while Romano was building his musical career, other members of his family faced far more difficult challenges in their attempts to survive the post-war reckoning. Anna Maria Mussolini's experience as the youngest child of Il Duce represents perhaps the most tragic aspect of inherited political guilt: the systematic persecution of a child who was too young to understand her father's crimes, yet old enough to suffer their consequences. Born in 1929, she was only 16 when her father's regime collapsed, making her the most vulnerable member of a family that had become synonymous with tyranny and oppression. During the height of fascist power, Anna Maria lived a privileged but carefully controlled life that was typical of dictators' children. She attended exclusive schools where her education was supervised by regime loyalists, participated in fascist youth organizations that indoctrinated her with party ideology, and appeared at public events designed to showcase the Mussolini family's supposed perfection and unity. The propaganda value of Anna Maria's childhood was carefully exploited by the regime's media apparatus. Photographs of her at family gatherings, school events, and cultural activities were distributed widely to reinforce the image of Mussolini as a devoted father and normal family man. These images, intended to humanize the dictator, would later become evidence of her association with the regime that made her a target for revenge. As the youngest member of the family, Anna Maria was often shielded from the more unpleasant aspects of her father's rule. She was not exposed to political discussions or regime business in the way that her older siblings had been, and her education emphasized traditional feminine accomplishments rather than political ideology. This protection, however, could not prevent her from absorbing fascist ideas through osmosis and social environment. The first signs of danger for Anna Maria came during the political crisis of 1943, when her father was arrested and the fascist government collapsed. Suddenly, the Mussolini name that had once guaranteed privilege and protection became a source of mortal danger. Anti-fascist groups viewed all family members as legitimate targets for revenge, regardless of their age or level of involvement in regime activities. Anna Maria Mussolini's teenage years were marked by trauma and fear. During her father's imprisonment and rescue by German forces, she grasped the danger, but not the full political turmoil surrounding her. Living in the puppet Republic of Salo under German guard, she faced constant threats from partisan forces. The civil war ravaging northern Italy turned her from a celebrated leader's daughter into a hunted fugitive. Her education was disrupted, tutors distanced themselves, and isolation stunted her development. The sustained terror left lasting psychological scars, including anxiety and depression, affecting her ability to form normal relationships. As Allied forces advanced and German protection waned, the danger intensified. In the final days before Mussolini's capture and execution, Anna Maria faced the grim reality that escape was unlikely and capture meant death. When her father was executed, she became an orphaned refugee, despised by many. Too young, inexperienced, and tied to a hated regime, Anna Maria's survival depended on mercy and resilience. Her struggles were only beginning, testing a teenager in ways no one should endure. After Benito Mussolini's execution in 1945, his children faced a perilous and chaotic Italy, where their family name marked them for death. Communist partisans hunted them relentlessly, placing bounties on their heads as a symbol of revolutionary justice. Vittorio escaped to South America, using a route through Switzerland to Argentina, a path others later tried to follow with mixed success. Romano, young and musically talented, found protection within Italy's jazz and entertainment circles, an ironic refuge given fascism's prior condemnation of jazz. Meanwhile, 16-year-old Anna Maria, lacking resources and connections, depended heavily on others' willingness to risk sheltering her. The Catholic Church became an unexpected refuge, offering sanctuary in convents and monasteries, though only in exchange for genuine repentance and secrecy. Some family members also found temporary safety with sympathetic friends, though these arrangements were fragile amid shifting political tides. Multiple factions sought the Mussolini children. Communist partisans aimed to execute them. Allied forces wanted to question them, and even former fascists posed threats. Their association with fascism made them targets in the post-war crackdown on war crimes, despite their limited direct involvement. The constant fear took a severe psychological toll, forcing them to live under assumed names, isolated and under strict caution. Loss of wealth forced many into poverty, a stark contrast to their former privileged lives. As Italy stabilized by 1946 to 47, legal scrutiny replaced mob justice. Debates arose over whether the children should be held accountable for their ties to fascism, complicated further by the emerging Cold War, which sometimes saw former fascists welcomed by anti-communist groups. Though immediate dangers eased, the Mussolini name remained a heavy burden, shaping their identities, relationships, and futures for decades. The children of Benito Mussolini faced a lifelong struggle to escape their father's shadow, a burden that persisted long after the fall of fascism. Their family name shaped every aspect of their lives, from personal relationships to career opportunities. Edda Mussolini's later years reflected these challenges. After exile, she returned to Italy, but lived quietly, forever marked by the violent deaths of her father and husband. The publication of Galeazzo Ciano's diaries, which she had once used as leverage during the war, kept the family legacy in the public eye, revealing fascist corruption and war crimes that haunted the Mussolinis for decades. Romano Mussolini found some respite through his success as a jazz musician, yet even his artistic achievements were overshadowed by his lineage, with critics and audiences alike unable to separate his talent from the legacy of his infamous father. Despite their efforts, the Mussolini children remained tethered to a past that continued to define and complicate their lives. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.